In a John Wayne war film, the sight of a general standing before an immense American flag would probably be a humbling reminder to audiences that nations are greater than the individuals who fight for them. In Patton, the sight of General George S. Patton standing before the Stars and Stripes paints quite a different picture. Patton, played by George C. Scott, walks into the frame long enough for us to understand the flag's enormity. The flag in turn provides a symbolic sense of scale for an ensuing montage of close-ups of Patton's outfit. Each close-up fills the screen just as the flag does in its wide shots, lending each of Patton's accoutrements, his ivory-handled pistols, his massively bushy right eyebrow, and enough medals to qualify as weight training, the same sense of large scale. With Patton's character dominating the narrative, it's reasonable to assume the film would be a projection of the general's enthusiasm for warfare. But unlike contemporary films like John Wayne's The Green Berets or Mike Nichols's Catch-22, Patton does not take a position on the questions it raises about war, patriotism, politics, or any other contentious subject. In 1970, Nixon's silent majority could rally around the scene where Patton risks enemy fire to ford a river for his army, while critics of America's foreign policy, in 1970 or 2020, could walk out of the film with Patton's line, "This is what happens when your commander stops being an American and starts being an ally," ringing in their ears. In other words, says Julie Kurgo in her lines for the Entrada release of the soundtrack, at a time of deep national division, Patton offered something for everyone. Jerry Goldsmith personally saw Patton as an anti-war film, but at the same time he acknowledged that his music was a character study of the general and not a political statement. Goldsmith's music for the general does not portray the monumental scenes of war Patton experiences, but rather reveals the general's impressions of them. Patton is a brilliant and belligerent military tactician who revels in the blood and gut-letting of his enemies. He's also a sensitive and ruminating poet who converses in the brash soldier's vernacular. He's a destructively selfish glory hound, a gentle comforter of wounded soldiers, and, perhaps most notably, he has faith in both Christ and reincarnation. He believes that the Almighty has been by his side in wars he has waged in past lives. Goldsmith, bless him, accounts for pretty much all of these character traits in his music. The sounds of military band, church chorale, and the composer's own signature electronic and acoustic manipulations of the orchestra evoke regions of Patton's mindscape. These elements collide, harmonize, and evolve to reflect the tempestuous moods of a mythic man. Rather than describe the ways in which these character themes for Patton interact with each other, I'd like to look at how the Patton March faces off with Goldsmith's Winter March in the Q German advance. The Winter March, introduced as German forces begin a desperate winter offensive against the Allies, is the score's only major theme not associated with Patton himself, and its encounter with the Patton March reveals new depths to the general's character. We'll take a look at this scene now. Note that I have raised the volume of the music to save it from being crushed under German tank treads.
Awful. The supplies are low. The German army hasn't mounted a winter attack since Frederick the Great. Therefore, I believe that's exactly what they're going to do. contingency plan for pulling out of our eastward attack, changing directions 90 degrees, moving up to Luxembourg. Don't look so stunned, Edward. I want you to plan for 3 possible axes of attack. From Dekirk due north, from Arlon to Bastogne, from Neufchâteau against the German left flank.
Man, that's a good scene. So now I'll describe it. It's a cold, snowy day in France, and the German army is preparing for a winter offensive. Trombones enter with a harsh and blaring treatment of the 4-note tonic to dominant descending ostinato that begins the Patton March. Gone is the march's playful setting for flute in the film's main titles, and its sweeping and heroic variations for the Third Army's passage through Europe earlier in the film. Now reduced to that 4-note figure, the march growls and thunders in the low brass, like the cry of an ancient war horn, as the bone-cold American POWs stamp their feet and shiver. These soldiers are a far cry from the cheering GIs, who swept across Europe in an earlier montage, accompanied by a full and rousing rendition of the Patton March. But while this 4-note march ostinato continues to evoke the powerful, relentless thrust of Patton's warrior resolve, the fragmented nature of that theme allows for the German army and Goldsmith's accompanying Winter March to take narrative and music supremacy in this scene. The muted brass instruments that begin the Winter March are almost comically opposed to the horns that thunder with Patton's march ostinato. Everything about the German army, from its tattered uniforms to the icy conditions that surrounds it, suggests low morale and physical exhaustion. The entire Winter March is practically anemic compared to the film's many robust renditions of the Patton March. The flutes in particular sound as cold and thin as the German men, while the dead acoustics of the muted trumpets are evocative of the muffled sounds and stillness of the punishing snowscape. There's a largely non-diatonic passacaglia that hobbles along underneath the Winter March theme. Sometimes it hits the downbeat, sometimes it stumbles through the middle of the bar in triplet figures, and it often arrives a minor second or tritone away from the melody at cadences. The bass figure's ambling rhythm and grinding timbre here suggests the wariness of the soldiers trudging through ice and snow, and in its dissonant counterpoint with the Winter March theme, the passacaglia represents the shambling state of the German army. It seems to me that film and music here are making a point not to overly villainize the Germans, if they're being villainized at all. They're certainly not on a quest to uncover the Ark of the Covenant. In fact, the Germans don't look much different from the miserable American POWs. When the Germans travel through a small village in this scene, the Winter March receives its most powerful statement, this time in horns. In this setting, the march is reminiscent of the music Goldsmith would write for various Eastern European adversaries in future action projects like Rambo First Blood Part 2, and Air Force One. Maybe there are good guys and bad guys in this scene after all. It doesn't help the case that the German soldiers move from right to left across the screen. That's the sort of ambulatory behavior that's basically the 20th century equivalent of texting with a phone not made by Apple. However, the Winter March and its accompaniment can be interpreted in a less antagonistic light when its reflection of the weather is considered. The whipping winds, trumpets, and strings that play overhead the horns here are reminiscent of the swirling snow and harsh winds that have picked up in this scene, and the power of the horns evokes the power of that growing storm. Are we supposed to fear the coming Teutonic threat, or do we pity the nameless enlisted men losing a war and caught in the storm? Patton, through its nuanced blending of imagery and music, remains ever ambiguous. Following the second interlude in Patton's headquarters, we return to the Germans a final time as they cross a bridge. Patton's March Ostinato returns in the brass in all of its original brutal form. The strings bring out a full, yearning rendition of the Winter March that illuminates the tragic inflections of the theme's minor mode contours for the first time. If the previous statement on horns gave an ambiguous view of the German advance, this rendition seems wholeheartedly sympathetic to their struggles, if not their cause. The Winter March has become a compelling lament for Patton's adversaries, and we subsequently feel that perhaps there really are no true heroes or villains. Just a lot of cold and hungry people, caught up in the gears of war. This sympathetic reading of the Germans is supported by the contrast between their wailing theme and the dark and relentless brass setting of the March Ostinato that plays against it at the cue's close. Here, the ostinato's first note is held for a full measure and a half, like a warning siren, or the roar of a massive beast, before descending in a foot-stomping single beat that flattens the Winter March cold. As the Winter March reaches its final cadence, it is overwhelmed by the martial brass and percussion, which drown out the Winter March's resolution and delivers the cue's pounding final say. Does the brass and percussion coda that drowns the Winter March out here represent the growing threat of the Germans, or their coming doom? And what doom may it represent? Patton and his Third Army, or the impersonal gears of war? German Advance is one of those scenes, and one of those cues, that moves you to reconsider the complex nature of people and the layered meaning of events. It's the welcome fallout, or as Patton might say, the payoff, of the battle between Goldsmith's marches. German Advance exemplifies how musical themes can interact in ways that bring depth to the characters they represent. It's not a novel concept, but studying the way in which a master like Goldsmith does so on a project of this caliber is a unique learning opportunity. And now that I've justified it, I just love looking at it and listening to it and studying it. This cue's great, this film is great. Go home and watch it. You already are home, just go watch it.